questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The number of people employed in Australia fell by 600,000 in April. This followed the Prime Minister's decision to deny a wage subsidy to casual workers, arts and entertainment workers and workers in the university and local government sectors. Aren't more Australians out of work today because the Prime Minister deliberately excluded them from the JobKeeper wage subsidy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No, Mr Speaker, that's not true. Mr Speaker, it's disappointing,
Members on my
Mr
left.
Speaker, that when the Labor Party says they're engaging in a bipartisan effort, it doesn't take long, Mr Speaker, for the white-handing to begin.
Member for Rankin. Member for Rankin.
It really doesn't take long, Mr Speaker, because the truth is 6 million Australians are benefiting from a JobKeeper program, Mr Speaker, that is being shouldered by taxpayers to the tune of more than $20 billion a month, Mr Speaker. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, there is the expansion of the JobSeeker program with the effective doubling of the JobSeeker payment, which has seen some almost 1.2 million additional Australians be able to go and get that additional payment with the COVID supplement, with the processing of those almost 1.2 million claims by Services Australia in a period of about 6 to 7 weeks, a set of claims which would normally be done over a 2-year period. Mr Speaker, the response of the government to the anticipated blow that would come from the COVID-19 crisis to Australia was to ensure on this day, an incredibly difficult day for Australians with more than almost 600,000 jobs lost in just 1 month. This was a day that this government anticipated and moved quickly and acted to ensure that both the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker programs, then the blow would be cushioned as a result of the decisions that we took as a government. And, Mr Speaker, Australians can continue to rely on that support from our government because we ensured that we put Australia in a place where, when this crisis hit, Mr Speaker—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance. The question was about whether there would be less people unemployed today if the Prime Minister hadn't have excluded them from the JobKeeper program.
The Prime Minister is in order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Australian people can count on this government to be there for them right here, right now, and we are for them here right now. 6 million Australians today are getting support through the JobKeeper program. Hundreds of thousands of businesses keeping them in jobs, Mr Speaker, because of a program unprecedented in scale and in reach across our economy, supported by the social safety net that is available through the JobSeeker program, which was extended and enlarged to encompass those, Mr Speaker, who would need it. Mr Speaker, had this government not done that and done it from a position of fiscal strength by bringing the budget back into balance and ensuring, Mr Speaker, that we could act in this time, we have been there for Australians. We will be there for Australians because the government knows how to manage money and ensure that those who are in deep need at the moment, Mr Speaker, are in a position to receive that support because of the great generosity of Australians.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government continues to support Australians through the health and economic challenges of the coronavirus pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I thank all of his constituents and the constituents of all members of this House for the way that they have banded together in what is such a difficult time. Almost 600,000 jobs lost in April, Mr Speaker. This is devastating news, but not news, sadly, that was unanticipated. It was important, Mr Speaker, that when we set out on dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, as a government, we called the pandemic before the WHO. We acted on the advice of the medical experts to list this as a virus of pandemic potential and then to activate the response plan. We knew that we had to fight this fight on the health front, but we also knew at exactly the same time that this was a fight that had to be fought on two fronts. On the economy, and on the health front, Mr Speaker. Not all agreed with us on that point. Some believe that we should only focus primarily on the health, but we always believed that we had to ensure that we had to deal with this issue on the economic front as well as the health front, Mr Speaker, and indeed we did. And so we moved through 3 successive packages, Mr Speaker, 3 substantial successive packages, working in concert with the Reserve Bank of Australia to ensure that we could put in place a platform that would support Australians through one of the most difficult times of their lives. I said at this dispatch box, Mr Speaker, that 2020 will be the toughest year of their lives for so many Australians, and that is proving to be true today as we have seen this first set of numbers when it comes to unemployment. And we anticipate that those figures, Mr Speaker, will get worse, and that is what we can expect. And that's why the programs we have put in place through the Job Seeker program, through the JobKeeper program, through the cash flow support for small businesses, Mr Speaker, all of these programs designed to ensure that Australians can get through this crisis and we can get to the other side. And now we're in the important phase. Having put that lifeline in place, having flattened the curve when it comes to the health challenge, we now need to address that curve when it comes to unemployment. This is the curve we need to change. That's why we're reopening Australia, Mr Speaker, and we're reopening it with confidence because of the health platform we build that will see Australians coming back into work. And that's why we will work to build confidence in the economy, to build momentum in that economy as we move back to a COVID-safe working environment, an economy which means that Australians can be supported through an economy that is built on businesses that are making their way again in a post-COVID world. Mr Speaker, we cannot have an economy that is addicted to the measures we currently have in place. They will break free of them eventually, and that is the day we look forward to, because on that day, Mr Speaker, we will be in a position for this economy to grow strongly again in the future.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. How many of the 600,000 fewer Australians who are employed in April were excluded from the JobKeeper wage subsidy?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I can tell you that the JobKeeper program has 860,600 employers, which is supporting 6 million employees. Mr Speaker, the cash flow boost program, because all of these measures go together in supporting employees. Some 503,900 businesses, Mr Speaker, supported by the cash flow boost program, which goes to those business employers to support people to stay in jobs. Some $9.1 billion on top of the JobKeeper payments that are paid to those businesses to keep those Australians in work, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, these programs are designed to keep people in jobs, and where those programs, Mr Speaker, are not able to be made available to all those throughout the economy, in addition to the 6 million, Mr Speaker, who are already supported, then the Job Seeker program is there to support them. These two programs work together, Mr Speaker, to provide the economic lifeline Australians need.
Will resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Nichols has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is continuing to build resilience in regional Australia to help it bounce back from drought, bushfires and now the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And the member for Mallee, in her 90-second statement, spoke about those wonderful farmers who, for the first time for many years, are planting a crop. And indeed, when I drove over here on Monday night, late as it was, every third or fourth paddock had lights on it. There were farmers out there busy turning the soil with their scarifiers, with planting seed, making sure that there was fertiliser out, planting their first crops in many cases for many years. And we exalt, we honour, we acknowledge those farmers, those brave primary producers, making sure that they're going to get their first crops after years of drought, Many of them, of course, had their rural communities affected by bushfires, and of course now regional Australia, like the rest of the nation, the rest of the world, is affected by COVID-19. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Nichols asked me about regional Australia and its response to COVID-19, and of course we are fighting back through the National Bushfire Recovery Agency. We heard from the member for Maranoa, the Minister for Emergency Management, give his ministerial statement and say what we were doing to help those fire-ravaged communities. And of course we've provided $8 billion towards drought relief and recovery efforts. We're continuing to do that, Mr Speaker, $2 billion with the Bushfire Agency, and certainly in the member for Nichols electorate, we are getting on with the job of building the infrastructure that those regional Victorians need, want, expect, and most of all, and I'm sure the member for Nichols would agree with me, they deserve it, Mr Speaker. And a couple of quotes out of that fine electorate represented by that fine representative. Rebecca Coates, who's the director of the New Shepparton Art Museum, abbreviated as SAM, and she says, what this building will encapsulate for people is a reflection of aspirations. It will be about presence, strength of character and a sense of pride and place. And we know that Shepparton is one of those communities which always punches well above its weight. It's a wonderful irrigation community. Its primary producers export to the world. We want also the arts side, whether it's events, whether it's artists themselves, to be their best selves, and Sam will do just that. And then we go to the General Manager of Crescas Brothers, a wonderful transport company in the members' electorate, Peter Hill. He said fuel is the single biggest cost, and I applaud and fully support the government's freeze on fuel excise. This means during this difficult period, extra costs will be saved along the whole supply chain, keeping prices down for customers and producers. The freeze on excise also means we can operate the business with confidence and keep all of our staff employed, and that's what it's about. That's what it's about. Whether it's job seeker, job keeper, the initiatives that we've done with drought, with fire and with COVID is keeping people in work, keeping those family-owned enterprises in regional Australia.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How much shorter would unemployment queues be today if the government had implemented the JobKeeper wage subsidy earlier and included more groups, including casuals?
Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's a joke getting a question about jobs from the member who was going to saddle Australians with the highest tax to GDP ratio in the history of the Commonwealth.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The member for Rankin will come to the dispatch box and withdraw.
I withdraw.
And the member for Rankin is warned. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the member for Rankin is well aware, we announced the most generous and most significant wage subsidy program in the history of this country, Mr Speaker, with some 6 million Australian workers covered by the 860,000 businesses that have formally enrolled in this program. Now, as the member for Rankin is aware, the eligibility for this program was set out very clearly. Full-time workers, part-time workers, long-term casuals, sole traders and those in the not-for-profit sector. And, as the member for Rankin is aware, Treasury has forecast that unemployment is expected to reach around 10%, but for the JobKeeper program it would have been 15%. So the JobKeeper program and the financial commitments from this government have helped to save lives and save livelihoods.
The member for Warringah.
Thank you. To the Prime Minister, the terms of reference of the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission indicate that the Commission will, and I quote, ensure the government receives the most comprehensive advice available to meet the challenges ahead. Yet its membership was not subject to public consultation or submission. There's no transparency about its governance and processes. Questions were raised yesterday at the Senate inquiry that manufacturing and industrial advice is being received from individuals with apparent conflicts of interest, and there is no requirement to focus on lowest cost and lowest emission technologies and opportunities. In the circumstances, how can the Australian people trust that the government will address all the challenges ahead?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, first of all, I thank the member for her question.
and all the arrangements that have been put in place for members of the COVID Commission have been arranged by the Department's Prime Minister and Cabinet, consistent with their rules and procedures that apply to all similar type appointments. And they are subject to the normal scrutiny, as you would expect, and that process is actually being pursued through the Senate committee process, which is entirely appropriate. So that transparency is available and present through those channels, and indeed through the ability for the member to raise matters as she has done here. Mr Speaker, the COVID Commission, which is led by Nev Power, a very distinguished and very accomplished Western Australian, is being tasked with the job of bridging the gap between the private sector and the government sector, principally to deal and troubleshoot problems that have arisen in relation to supply chains that have been impacted as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. That has seen us being able to connect supply chains to access critical medical supplies, to deal with supply chain issues, to get much-needed food stores to remote Indigenous communities, as well as to regional towns and even metropolitan centres all across the country, particularly in those early days where we saw the rush on those stores and stocks at various times. That Commission has been working on ensuring the continuity of freight transport around the country from one side to the other, despite the fact that there have been borders now erected between states and territories. But as a result of the work done by the Commission, we've been able to see those trucking lanes remain open and the transport of valuable goods and supplies to be able to move around the country. Those groups within the COVID Commission have been working to ensure, with people like Greg Combay, that we can deliver COVID-safe workplaces. And they've worked closely together with the Minister for Industrial Relations and the Attorney-General, so Australians can be going back to work in a safe way, in a partnership between employers and employees. These are the important gaps that we have to close when it comes to ensuring the private sector and the public sector are working together to deal with the problems that have arisen as a result of the tremendous shocks to our economy and the distribution of services that is a result of what has happened with COVID-19. Now, I applaud their work. I think they are doing absolutely amazing work. When I called them and asked them to do this, I said, I need you to serve your country. And they are serving our country. And this House should be very proud of their service.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how the Morrison government's economic support packages have been saving jobs and supporting livelihoods, including in my electorate of Robertson?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question. Acknowledge that prior to coming to this place she was a school teacher, she's an active lifesaver and she cares deeply about her constituents. And she's also a strong believer in the importance of the JobKeeper program and the other measures that we have announced to support Australians at this difficult time. Now, Mr Speaker, today's unemployment numbers are starting to reveal the real economic impact, the painful economic impact that the coronavirus is having. With some 594,000 fewer people in work, an unemployment rate at 6.2%. These are our neighbours, these are family members, these are friends, these are workmates, people who are really struggling economically, worried about their job security, worried about their economic future at this time. That is why, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government has announced over $320 billion worth of financial support at this critical time, including the Job Seeker coronavirus supplement of $550, a 50% wage subsidy for apprentices, the JobKeeper program at $130 billion. And it is helping people right across this country, like Michael, who runs a local cafe in Gosford, South End Social, who's put his staff on JobKeeper, and he's said the following: without the JobKeeper payment, my cafe would still be closed and I have had to let go of my hard-working staff. It's the sole reason I am able to keep the cafe open and running today. The day that this payment was announced, I and many other people in the hospitality sector breathed a huge sigh of relief, knowing that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, Mr Speaker. Like Tim, who runs the Australian Reptile Park in Somersby, who said, "We can't stop having staff here to facilitate, to feed and to care for our animals. But the JobKeeper payment has been a game-changer and means the impact to our business has been so radically reduced." Mr Speaker, these are the practical examples. These are the real-life stories of Australians and their businesses who are being saved by the JobKeeper package. While others may seek to be negative and talk down the Australian economy, we are getting on with the job of helping Australians through this difficult time. We know that Australian families are struggling. We know that Australian businesses are doing it tough, but their government has their back.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has said that the government will not provide assistance to Virgin Airlines because the government would only take a sector-wide approach. Why then has the government provided nearly $54 million in an untied cash grant to majority foreign-owned Rex Airlines, which employs around 1,000 workers, but no equivalent support for Virgin, which employs almost 10,000 workers?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the
member for Ballarat.
Finished? Can I get on with my answer? You want to hear the answer?
The Deputy Prime Minister will pause for a second. The member for Rankin has already been warned. There's no need to walk. No more. Takes a lot to get thrown out at this point in time, but I haven't forgotten how to do it. And the member for Ballarat, having asked her question, will not then try and conduct a conversation across the table. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Transport for her question. Mr Speaker, we have committed more than $1.2 billion of support to cushion the aviation industry. It's been very, very hard hit by COVID-19. It has been very hard hit. And please let me. And Virgin Australia went into COVID-19, and they were doing it tough, Mr Speaker. Aviation is a tough industry. The margins are small, and they need to be their best selves. And we want to see two commercially viable airlines coming out of the back of COVID-19. I'm sure I share that view with every member of the House. I'm sure I do, Mr Speaker. And any assistance we have provided to aviation has been sector-wide. Yes, regional airlines, Regional Express, has benefited from the $1.2 billion of sector-wide support. Yes, they have benefited from the $100 million underwriting. Yes, they have benefited from the $198 million that we've provided for regional airlines to go to service those 138 communities, but for Rex, but for QantasLink, but for Virgin and but for those other fine regional airlines which fly into those country centres. They would not have been serviced, and some of those country centres would not have been receiving the frontline medical personnel. Some of those regional centres would not have been provided with the personal protection equipment. Some of those regional services would not have been provided with the face masks that they received. Thanks.
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. The question goes to the untied cash grant of $54 million, and he hasn't referred to it at all.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. I'll listen carefully to him as he answers the question.
We are supporting each and every airline through our sector-wide assistance. We are supporting Rex, yes. We are supporting Qantas, yes. We are supporting very much Virgin. And we're very pleased that Virgin, there are potentially 19, in fact, potentially even more investors. And of course tomorrow, the preliminary bids as part of the voluntary administration process, which Paul Scurra, the CEO of Virgin, spoke to him this week. We're going through, and we've appointed Nicholas Moore to liaise with the voluntary administrators. He's reporting back to Treasury. He's reporting back to me. We want to make sure that we have two commercially viable airlines through this. I'm sure that is the view of everybody in this House. And all of those airlines, they're supporting workers, and there have been many workers from Virgin who have contacted me, and I am writing back and personally signing each and every one of those bits of correspondence. Yes, each and every one, because they are important to me, as I'm sure they're important to you. We want those jobs. 10,000 people work for Virgin. I want to make sure that through this process, as many of those workers still have a job, and I'm sure that view is shared.
Time has concluded. The member for Ballarat seeking to table a document.
Yes, I am. The extract from the Government's Grants Connect website showing the funding received by REX of $54 million under the Regional Airlines Funding Assistance, which has not been made available to Virgin Australia.
The Leader of the House, I think, is about to preempt me, but that's okay. The Leader
Leave not granted.
Leave's not granted. I was just going to say when things are publicly and widely available, the practice. I member for Ballarat, if you can just cease your interjections for a second, just for guidance. When things are publicly available, leave isn't given, but also I don't even ask for leave, and by virtue of the way you described it as being on a public website, you've sort of answered your own question on that. The member for Boothby.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is investing in Australian research to find a vaccine or treatment for COVID-19?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Boothby, in particular, firstly, for her work in helping to secure the funding of $30 million for the Brain and Spinal Rehabilitation Unit at the REPAT Centre, which will make a real difference both to treatment but also to research on medical grounds in her own electorate, as well as to say to the people of South Australia, well done. One case in 7 days. One continuing case across the whole of the state that has not recovered so far. That's part of the Australian success story with regards to coronavirus. But the world will not be fully successful until we have a long-term solution. So whilst Australia is making enormous progress, one of the things we have to do is work with our amazing research community on vaccines, antivirals, respiratory medicines, all of the different things that can assist with finding a way out of the general challenge provided by COVID-19. As part of that, the Prime Minister announced last week a total Australian contribution of $352 million to the International Pledging Conference, including $15 million for the work of CEPI, the International Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness. Within Australia, in particular, there's $230 million for the CSIRO's Centre for Disease Preparedness, an important initiative which will equip Australia to be in an even stronger position going forwards. Within the Medical Research Future Fund, there's $36 million which is supporting cutting-edge Australian research. In particular, on vaccines, we can see that there are a number of Australian universities making progress. We have already sponsored the work of the University of Queensland, the Doherty Institute and the CSIRO with $3 million on very promising vaccine work. Others are in an application process, including Flinders University, which is within the member's own electorate. I believe the member for Boothby is a graduate of the university. The Burnet Institute, Monash, Westmead Institute, great Australian medical research centres. The work on antivirals is being sponsored with $8 million, including $3 million towards the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in my own home city of Melbourne, where they are leading a national clinical trial on the preventive capabilities of hydroxychloroquine. And then there's the work on antivirals, where $5 million is available. All of this is about long-term preparedness, giving Australia the path back, as well as building on our world-class health and medical research sector to ultimately save lives and protect lives.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer explain why a 20-year-old working one shift per week at a clothes store and living at home receives the full $1,500 JobKeeper wage subsidy, but arts and entertainment workers who work gig to gig and event to event are excluded?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, the reality is we've set out a wage subsidy program at $1,500, a flat rate, so that if you earned more, you wouldn't get a greater wage subsidy from the government. That was the program that we set out. In terms of who it covers, it was very clear. It would cover full-time workers, it would cover part-time workers, cover long-term casuals based on the established understanding in the Fair Work Act, as well as sole traders and the not-for-profit sector. When it comes to the arts sector, we've announced a number of particular initiatives to support that sector at this difficult time, but I'd like the House to acknowledge that some 6 million employees, workers, are now covered by the JobKeeper payments based on the 860,000 businesses that have enrolled. If you add that to the 1.6 million Australians who are covered by the job seeker payment, that's more than half the workforce. 6 million plus 1.6 million, 7.6 million when you consider that the Australian labour force is today 13.2 million people.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government continues to support farmers and communities affected by drought during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Grey for his question. He knows probably better than anyone the impacts this drought has had on his communities as it spread like a cancer from Queensland right across this country. And despite COVID-19, we continue to focus on those communities and farmers affected by drought through our national drought strategy with 3 distinct pillars. One is about the here and now, the second is about the communities to support the farmers, the third is about the future. And the here and now is very important. It's about keeping bread and butter on people's tables during these tough times, getting farmers through. We've got the Farm Household Allowance that does that, and in fact we lifted that in line with the COVID response. That payment now matches that of the job seeker payment to ensure those farming families didn't miss out. We also have worked with the Regional Investment Corporation to specifically create a new product, drought loans, that means that farmers can refinance up to $2 million of their existing debt from their bank to the Regional Investment Corporation and pay no interest and no repayments for 2 years. It's up to $120,000 if you're on 6%. That's taking out of big banks' pockets and putting it back in farmers' pockets and putting it back into communities' pockets, because that gets spent. So we've thought about how we're going to get these farmers through, and it's also about their opportunity to replant and restock out of that as well, because cash flows take time to recover after drought. But we've got to support the communities in our second pillar, and that's very important because the drought extends past the farm gate into the communities that support them. And we've put out a stimulus through the Drought Communities program, stimulating economic development in these communities with $1 million going to these councils to do shovel-ready projects that will get tradies going, procuring local materials out of the local hardware store. And then in the next week or so we'll also be announcing an extra $200 million under the Building Better Regions Fund specifically for drought communities, to not just get them community through the drought, but actually create new jobs. So we haven't stood still. We're looking to the future. And that's the third pillar. The third pillar is quite important. The third pillar is we are the first government in our nation's history to think about the next drought while we are tackling the existing one. Because the next drought starts the very first day after it stops raining. And that's important to understand. And that's been through a suite of measures. The first, and one that has also an economic stimulus, is things like dog fencing. And the member for Grey would know firsthand. He has been a champion of dog fencing, and what that does is builds the resilience in the future of sheep particularly. And bringing sheep back into communities is very important, because invariably that brings shearers back. And shearers are probably one of the best group of people to leave a few dollars in town after they've been there. But the next biggest tranche will come into effect on the 1st of July, when the Future Drought Fund will pay its first dividend, legislated dividend. It will look to the future in ensuring we build the resilience of these communities with programs that support them and build the resilience for the future. We are the first government to say we need to understand that droughts will come again, and we need to prepare our communities for that. We will stand with our
Minister's
farmers
time
all the way
has
through.
concluded. I call the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Here's a real-life story. Scott works in theatre and lives in my electorate. He was due to start a 3.5-year full-time contract in May on the stage production Frozen. He's not eligible for JobKeeper because he's a casual with less than 12 months' experience, and his future contract is not taken into account. Why has the government left Scott and 600,000 other Australians behind?
The Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, we're absolutely taking Scott into account with a doubling of the effective New Start and the $550 job seeker coronavirus supplement, Mr Speaker, at $1,100. This is effectively a doubling of that safety net that was previously in place. Now, Mr Speaker, as the honourable member will know, some 6 million Australians are now covered by the businesses that are formally enrolled for the JobKeeper payment, together with the 1.6 million that are on the job seeker payment. So we're talking over half the Australian workforce. But I could also let the honourable member know, through the PM's work, through the National Cabinet, the work of the Premiers and the Chief Ministers, they've set out a 3-stage framework for lifting the restrictions. Now, Treasury have forecast that the benefit to the economy and to jobs from lifting those restrictions, based on the health advice, will be some 850,000 jobs and $9.4 billion to the economy. Now, in relation to those who work in the arts and the recreation sector, if those 3 stages are followed through, 76,000 jobs will be created, or people will get back to work in that particular sector. When you look at opening pubs, cafes, entertainment venues and other venues, you're looking at a $2.4 billion dividend to the Australian economy. So, Mr Speaker, we know that we needed to put in place temporary, targeted, proportionate measures in response to the biggest economic shock that Australia has ever seen. At $320 billion, or 16.4% of GDP, this is a very substantial commitment, as is required at this very difficult time. But there are stories right across this country, some that I've repeated in this House today and yesterday, where our JobKeeper program and our Job Seeker program are saving lives and livelihoods.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House border measures the Morrison government has put in place to protect Australians from COVID-19 pandemic? And how are the dedicated staff at Home Affairs and the Australian Border Force working to keep Australians safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
It's not over yet. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Moncrieff and start by acknowledging the wonderful work that she's done at Southport, where she, through her advocacy, has been able to encourage the government to open another border clearance station there, which will bring a lot of jobs and economic activity to the Gold Coast. So it really is a very good outcome, Mr Speaker. Obviously, all of us are incredibly proud of the work that the men and women of the Australian Border Force have done at our borders over the course of the last couple of months. They're exceptional law enforcement officers, and they have represented our government, our country, very well. And I think their families should be very proud of the work that those individuals have done, and they've contributed to the safety of our country, and they've contributed to the health outcome that we've been able to achieve in this country through this pandemic, Mr Speaker. In addition to that, I want to pay tribute to the officers at the Department of Home Affairs, many of whom have been involved in all different aspects of the Home Affairs response to this pandemic, but also many that have gone across to Services Australia and to other government departments to try and supplement the support there, to provide early access to payments for Australians that are in need. And also, Mr Speaker, I want to make mention of the Australian Federal Police officers who around the country obviously have been involved in frontline services, but in particular almost 100 officers who have gone to the Northern Territory to provide support to the Northern Territory Police to help protect Indigenous communities from the COVID virus there. They've been incredibly successful, and I really pay tribute to them. Mr Speaker, in this week last year, we had about 363,000 people who arrived by air into our country. Over the last 7 days, 6,112 people have arrived. So there's been obviously a 98% downturn, which has been a significant change for the Australian Border Force workload. And many of those officers now have been able to go into other parts of the Border Force business. They've gone into, for example, looking at ways in which we can reduce inbound contraband. They've done a lot of work in outbound as well, and they have detected, Mr Speaker, heading out from our country about 450,000 face masks. They have detected 142 consignments containing over 9,000 units of hand sanitizer. And at a time, Mr Speaker, in this pandemic, when we had shortages here in our country, we wanted to make sure that we could divert that product which was being sent overseas back to the use of Australians through the national stockpile. And they have been incredibly successful, and again they should be very proud of the work that they've been able to do. So I thank them for their service. I say to all Australians we should be very grateful for the way in which they quickly enacted the government's direction to close our borders. It was done in a very quick period of time, obviously one of the first nations in the world to do so, and it has directly resulted in the amazing outcomes we've been able to achieve for our country.
The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. The Peninsula Aquatic and Recreation Centre in my electorate employs approximately 300 people. None of them are eligible for the JobKeeper wage subsidy. Why have they and 600 other Australians been deliberately left behind?
The Treasurer has the call. Member for Deakin.
Mr Speaker, the particular organisation that the honourable member refers to may indeed be a creature of local government. Now, if it's a creature of local government, it was very clearly set out in the eligibility criteria that local government are creatures of state governments, Mr Speaker, and state governments have their own balance sheets and state governments have their own ability to support the staff and the businesses and the organisations like that one referred to. And, Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister points out, the New South Wales government made an announcement in relation to childcare, in relation to local government-run childcare centres, Mr Speaker. But the reality is this JobKeeper program, with now over 860,000 businesses formally enrolled, is supporting some 6 million workers, some in the not-for-profit sector, others who are sole traders, others who are part-time and full-time workers or long-term casuals. When you combine that with the Job Seeker program and 1.6 million people who are on that, you've got a combination of 7.6 million workers, Mr Speaker. That's out of a total labour force of 13.2 million.
For Lawler.
Now, Mr Speaker, the best way that we can get people back into jobs is to continue to grow the economy, is to follow the health advice, is to ease the restrictions, and as Treasury forecasts, some 850,000 people will be back in jobs as a result of those Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3 lifting of restrictions as agreed by National Cabinet. Now, that includes many workers in recreational centres, in gyms, in swimming centres and the like, Mr Speaker. I suggest the honourable member lobbies the Labor state government in Victoria.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting Australian small business through the defence supply chain?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for Ford for his question. I just want to note his great passion for defence industry, and it reminds me of some very wonderful visits that I've had to Ford to visit defence industry, Australian small businesses, one in particular, PWR, who is a wonderful example of an Australian business which produces very cool advanced cooling systems, and 9 out of 10 Formula One teams use that system, so it indeed is very, very capable. Mr Speaker, during this COVID-19 period, it's been critical that we've been able to keep the wheels of small defence industry turning. Those 15,000 businesses dotted across the whole of the country, together with those 70,000 employees. What we have done to keep small business strong is focused very much on ensuring that they are paid as early as possible. As we know, cash flow has been critical, not just to small business but to big business. So well done to the Defence Department and CASG. By and large, we've paid a lot of those invoices early. Since late March, we've paid around 100,000 invoices, some $6 billion in invoices, and some 4.5 of that was indeed early. Most of those payments go directly to the primes, but we've worked with the primes to ensure that they have their own processes in place and indeed to ensure that they then pay the smaller contractors. It really has been a remarkable effort on behalf of all of the industry. The other thing that we've been focusing on, Mr Speaker, is estate works, and we've identified around $870 million worth of estate works that we can bring forward, which of course is a great boon for our construction companies. One of the benefits with respect to COVID-19, Mr Speaker, has been the restrictions to state borders. And what this has meant is that many of the local subbies, so the local plumber or the local electrician, who ordinarily wouldn't get a go at some of these bases, has indeed had an opportunity to get some of that work. So long may that continue. We continue to remain focused on capability, and recently I had the pleasure, together with the Minister for Defence, to announce a new $350 million project, I should say, with respect to 6 new Cape-class patrol vessels by Austell in Western Australia, saving thousands of jobs and also saving thousands of, so I should say hundreds of small businesses in their supply chain. During this period, Mr Speaker, it has been critical to have a high level of engagement, communication. Every week I've been speaking to all of the primes, industry groups, master builders, and I want to thank them for their cooperation, their collaboration. Without us understanding what their problems were on a daily basis, it would have been difficult for us, as I say, to keep the show on the road. So together with our payment of early invoices and together with JobKeeper, I'm absolutely sure that we have saved thousands of jobs. So I just want to thank the Australian defence industry for all their efforts.
The Minister's time has concluded, and I call the member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction and Energy. Last year, the House was assured that the minister would fully cooperate with the New South Wales Police Strike Force Garrett investigation.
On my right.
But the New South Wales Police have given evidence to the New South Wales Parliament that the minister rejected an interview request. Why did the minister promise the House he'd cooperate with the investigation, but then refuse to be interviewed by the New South Wales Police?
Just before I call the minister, I'll hear from perhaps the Leader of the House. I just need to be convinced that I just need to be. Well, I can rule on it whenever you're ready. I've made the point when it comes to ministerial responsibilities. Certainly, questions can't be asked about policy areas for which the minister's not responsible. They can be asked about a minister's previous answer, but as I've made clear, that's been referring to the minister's previous answer. I'll hear from the Leader of the House on it. I think it's. Oh, sorry, I hear from the Manager of Opposition Business on it if he's.
The minister promised that.
Speaker, while it doesn't use the term answer, it refers to an assurance that the minister gave to the House. Now, ministers have a responsibility to the House when they provide that information, and for us to be able to test.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'll call the minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And of course, I didn't refuse an interview with the New South Wales Police, and as the New South Wales Police have said in their responses to questions on notice in the New South Wales Parliament, we replied, answered questions and provided documentation. Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, I remind those opposite that they made this political police referral last year, and since then the New South Wales Police have considered and closed this matter. The AFP have considered and closed this matter, and the Commissioner, no less, has said the matter is finalised, full stop. Finalised, full stop. So I'm getting on with protecting lives and livelihoods, as should those opposite.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the Minister update the House on the resilience of the Australian resource sector in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, and will the Minister outline what this government is doing to ensure the sector helps power Australia into economic recovery?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for their question. And the people of the Mallee pulled the right rein when they elected the member in 2019. She is wearing the track and the carpet to my office, fighting for mineral sands and resources in her sector, and clearly understands that agriculture and resources can cohabit. They can be effective. It has been a fantastic effort by the member for Mallee. Now, Mr Speaker, I want to be very clear on this, very clear. For all of those individuals who are out there working in the resources sector, the Morrison-McCormack government is absolutely committed to the success of our resources sector, and we will do what is needed to ensure they continue that success. Now, they are delivering for our economy, Mr Speaker. As I'm sure you know, it is one of the few areas of our economy that continues to have a green light. Now, that did not happen by accident. So I do want to point out that my opposites, the shadow ministers, did reach across the aisle. We have worked closely where it was necessary, and also to my state counterparts. Quite simply, they have put aside the red team and the blue team. As the Prime Minister has said, we are all in the green and gold tracksuit, Mr Speaker. We are all in the green and gold tracksuit. So the work continues. The resources sector, Mr Speaker, quite simply have been magnificent in their response. They have been magnificent. To the workers out there in their high-vis and their steel-cap boots, whether it's the unions or their organisers or the representatives, whether it is the company or the industry bodies, they have been magnificent. They have done what is necessary. They have improvised. They have adapted. They have overcome. And they will continue to work for this country. They will continue to be employed. They will continue to export those great products right around the world. Now, Mr Speaker, I should note people like BHP, the big Australian. They should be absolutely applauded for their efforts. They've employed hundreds of additional Australians, and they will in essential roles over the next 6 months. In fact, Arrow Energy, for example, have announced that they will develop their Surat gas project during the pandemic. Now, that is an indication of confidence. That is an indication of confidence, and long may it continue. Now, as I said, the member's interest is in the mineral sands industry in her electorate. It is part of Australia's critical minerals agenda. And I continue business as usual, working with our counterparts right around the world. In fact, teleconferences with my opposite number in Japan, with my opposite number in the US, and particularly focused on critical minerals because it will be a strategic supply chain into the future. Now, we must continue our work around reducing red and green tape for our sectors to be successful. But once again, Mr Speaker, I want to place on record the Parliament's thanks, my thanks, the people's thanks for the work that the resources workers have done. They have moved. They have spent longer away from their families. They have done what is necessary because, quite simply, they had to. They should be proud of themselves and what they've done, and long may it continue.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction and Energy. On 24 October last year, in answer to a question, the minister told the House that a document with fake numbers was drawn from the City of Sydney website. But New South Wales Police have told the New South Wales Parliament that they found no evidence that the minister's office downloaded the annual report from the City of Sydney's website. Does the minister stand by his statement to the House? And why won't the minister tell the House where the document came from?
The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I do stand by the statement I made on the 25th of October that the document was accessed from the City of Sydney website. And let me read from the department's evidence.
Minister, just pause for a second. The members for Shortland and others will cease interjecting. I'm trying to listen to the minister's answer. The minister has the call.
And let me read from the department's evidence, which was made public in January, 4 months ago. The department did ascertain that the City of Sydney's website was accessed by the Minister's office on the 9th of September 2019. The department system allows individuals to directly print from the website. Now, Mr Speaker, this matter was the 9th political referral from those opposite, and in keeping with the previous 8, the matter was considered and closed not once but twice, Mr Speaker. Not once, but twice. And as the Commissioner said, the matter is finalised, full stop. So I'm getting on with protecting lives and livelihoods, because I tell you what, Mr Speaker, I know that a strong Australia coming out of the COVID-19 crisis requires a secure and reliable supply of energy, liquid fuels, of gas and electricity. That's what I'm focusing on every day. Those opposite should do the same.
The member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services. Will the Minister outline to the House on measures the Morrison government has implemented to support people with a disability throughout the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Braddon for his question and all his hard work supporting almost 2,000 participants in his electorate. The Morrison government moved quickly when the crisis came upon us, and in early March the government convened the first of a number of Emergency Disability Reform Council DRC ministers, where all state and territory ministers collectively got together to work through our national response. Out of that first meeting on the 18th of March, $1.1 billion worth of measures were agreed by all state and territory ministers and the Commonwealth, which included two key components at that initial stage. One, allowing providers to bill forward 1 month's worth of their invoicing to ensure they had cash flow necessary, and also adding a 10% loading onto core support activities so participants would have the knowledge that any support being provided to them was cognizant of and included anything that required to assist with the COVID-19 spread. This built on the $320 billion worth of assistance that all arms of government have provided in response to this extraordinary circumstance. Further DRC meetings across April and May have announced a range of measures that including extending plans up to 24 months, greater flexibility for participants across their plans, ensuring continuity of support and increased capacity of NDIA staff to focus on urgent and required changes. We move to phone planning. We're reaching out to 62,000 vulnerable participants to ensure they're getting the services they need. Priority access has been arranged through the major supermarkets for delivery of groceries. We made changes to supported independent living to deal with any potential vacancies, temporarily increased the flexibility for participants to purchase low-cost assistive technology items, including smart devices, so they could access innovative applications from home, and of course allocated over $500,000 PPE masks to the sector. And it's incredibly pleasing to see a very low level of notification of participants and support workers relating to COVID-19 infections. We've also seen weekly provider payments remain steady, demonstrating the NDIS market has responded well to the pandemic. The quarterly report for the end of March 2020 was released this week that also has shown 27,500 new participants have joined the NDIS this quarter, with now nearly 365,000 people now being supported across Australia. And most pleasingly is, despite COVID-19, we've seen significant improvements across all areas of timely support through the scheme. Can I thank everyone in the House and all members who've worked steadily in their areas to care for people with disability.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister tell the House yesterday about his sports rewards scheme that, and I quote, the only authority sought from the Prime Minister's office and from me was in relation to announcements, when the Audit Office found the Prime Minister's office told Senator McKenzie's office, and I quote, it was expected that the Minister would write to the Prime Minister to seek authority on the approved projects and inform the Prime Minister of the rollout plan?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I said it because it was true.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting Indigenous communities through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Can I thank the member for Sturt for his question and his ongoing interest in this issue. As all of us in this chamber know, the most vulnerable section of our community are Indigenous Australians. So right from the beginning, what we did is we worked with elders and leaders and peak organisations, and working with my colleague Greg Hunt, we used the Biosecurity Act to define secure areas for remote communities in order to isolate them from people bringing COVID-19 in. One of the best expressions I heard was an elder who said, "This thing has no songline, and we don't want to create a songline that brings death." And so the Indigenous leadership at every level stood up. And when I look at the figures, there are only 59 known COVID cases in a population of 800,000. That represents less than 1% of the total number of COVID cases in Australia. And the interventions that we put into place, the biosecurity measure in terms of COVID-19 testing, Minister Hunt provided $3.3 million in conjunction with his Indigenous advisory body to key sites around Australia where point-of-care testing would be immediate, and then we could take the relevant steps to isolate those communities at high risk. The other interventions that were important was ensuring food security. And the National Indigenous Agency worked very closely with food supply chains in order to make sure that we had guaranteed food supplies even in the most remote community stores. And I want to acknowledge Metcash, Woolworths and Coles for joining with all of our stores in providing that continuous supply. With the first tranche of funding, what we saw was a 350% increase by Indigenous communities in purchasing food, hygiene and cleaning products. So that measure was an important measure, and stores were able to cope with that. In addition, we provided funding for people to return to outstations in the Northern Territory, because a lot of people said they were more secure by going to their communities. But the combined efforts over a number of initiatives has resulted in that low figure. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague Peter Dutton as the Minister for Home Affairs, because we jointly signed a letter to guarantee food supplies from the food suppliers, the point of delivery, and that made a difference. But I want to, on behalf of this parliament, thank all Indigenous leaders at every level for showing the leadership to make a difference at the community level and to have an impact that saw an incredible low level of impact, but we cannot take our eyes off the ball because there is still a possibility. Thank you.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is again to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's earlier answer, such as it was. Why did the Prime Minister's office want sports rorts grants sent to the Coalition's campaign headquarters? Is there any aspect of this program that wasn't rorted?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can only assist the member by referring to the many responses I've given to this matter, Mr Speaker. It was very clear the authority for making the decisions on this matter was the Minister for Sport, Mr Speaker. Public release guidelines clearly stated that the Minister was the final decision-maker and that could take into account many other issues, Mr Speaker. That's how the process was run. Mr Speaker, today we heard information released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics that almost 600,000 Australians have lost their jobs. Mr Speaker, that's where my focus is. I'll leave the Australian people to leave it to their judgment to see where the opposition's focus is.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Personnel and Veteran Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on how Australians commemorated our veterans and our servicemen and women this past Anzac Day?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I do thank the member for Canning for his question and recognise his service to our nation in uniform. And, Mr Speaker, as you're well aware, and every member in this place is well aware, Anzac Day is one of the most important days on our national calendar. And typically we gather in large numbers to commemorate the service and the sacrifice, the courage, the resilience of the original Anzacs. But this year, unfortunately, Mr Speaker, we couldn't gather in those sorts of numbers. We were required, through social distancing rules, to pay our own respects our own private way. And I've got to say, Mr Speaker, just like the original Anzacs, Australians proved incredibly innovative Anzac Day this year. It brought us all great joy to see our fellow countrymen gather on their front doorsteps, in their driveways, at the front of farm paddocks, some of them playing the last post on bugles. I heard the last post played on electric guitar for the first time in my own community. So it was incredible to see the way the Australian people still want to commemorate the fallen on Anzac Day this year. I think, Mr Speaker, we kept our promise to remember them. The National Service, as televised from the Australian War Memorial this year, Mr Speaker, attracted a viewing audience in excess of 1.8 million people. I want to thank the Prime Minister, the Governor-General, the Opposition Leader, Wing Commander Sharon Bowen, our Repatriation Commissioner Don Spinks, Legatee, Junior Legatee Stephanie Kindness, and all those who were able to attend and show respectful consideration to all those who served both today and in the past. I also want to thank the Australian War Memorial itself for hosting the event in difficult circumstances, and my own department, the Department of Veterans Affairs, for the way it conducted the commemorative activities. In just a couple of months' time, Mr Speaker, we will gather again for a major commemorative event. This year, August 15 marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and we are hoping that the social distancing rules will allow larger gatherings, but we are working with the veteran community, and I'll be keeping members informed of the opportunities to participate in that commemoration as the time draws closer. But on a sadder note, Mr Speaker, I would like to acknowledge today the passing and to pay my respects on behalf of the Parliament to a true friend of Australia, Dr Patrick Simon AO. As Mayor of Villers-Bretonneux in northern France, which is obviously close to so many of the memorial sites that Australians visit, Dr Simon continued the tradition of the annual Anzac Day service in Villers-Bretonneux and was extraordinarily important in the renovation of the Franco-Australian First World War Museum in Villers-Bretonneux. He was a strong supporter and an outstanding voice for the establishment of the Sir John Monash Centre, and always provided very warm, incredibly friendly and hospitable welcome to any travelling Australians in his region. He was a very proud Frenchman, but he was also very proud of his Australian links. When I say to Dr Simon was awarded the Honorary Order of Australia in 2015. So he'll be sadly missed. He fell victim to the coronavirus pandemic. May he rest in peace.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.